My father lifted his champagne flute at the head of the table, and his voice carried across the entire ballroom. 40 years of marriage, he said. Tonight we celebrate the woman who gave me everything. He turned to my mother. Then his eyes traveled to my younger sister, who was glowing beside him in a cream silk dress. And tonight, he continued, we also celebrate the next chapter. The grandchild we've been waiting for. I was standing near the back of the room holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my father raise that toast to a baby that didn't exist yet. My sister was 4 months pregnant. Meanwhile, my own daughter, his actual first grandchild, had turned 10 months old that morning. She was at home in Portland with my husband, sleeping in her crib in bumblebee pajamas. My father had never met her. My name is Tessa. I'm 31 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a firm that designs hospitals. I've lived in Portland, Oregon for 6 years, almost 3,000 miles from where I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. My family is what people politely call old money. My father owns half the commercial real estate downtown. My mother sits on every charity board that matters. My younger sister, Bryony, never left. She married a banker named Pierce when she was 23 and moved into a house 6 minutes from her parents. I was always the less favored daughter. Not something I'm making up. It's just a fact. Bryony was the pretty one, the charming one. The one who could walk into a room and make everyone laugh. I was the quiet one. The one who liked math. The one who read in corners instead of dancing at debutante balls. My father used to call us his book and his butterfly. He meant it as a compliment to both of us. It wasn't. I moved to Portland for graduate school and told myself I'd never come back. I met my husband Holden in my second year. He's a pediatric nurse. He proposed to me on a hiking trail with a ring his grandmother had left him. We got married at a small vineyard in the Columbia Gorge. 22 people came. None of them were from my family. My parents had been invited. My mother RSVP'd no. My father said he had a closing. Bryony sent a vase and a card that said wish we could be there. 2.5 years later I got pregnant. The moment I saw that second pink line, something shifted inside me. I called my mother before anyone else except Holden. I was crying. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. Let me tell your father." I asked if I could tell him myself. She said he was at the office and she didn't want me to interrupt his afternoon. She would handle it. He didn't call me back. Not that day. Not the next day. Not the day after that. I called the office directly. The receptionist, a woman named Ilea, told me he was in a meeting. I left my name. He didn't call back. I called again the next week. Same thing. My mother kept telling me he was busy traveling, stressed about a deal. She told me to give him time. When my daughter was born, I had stopped trying. Holden's parents flew out for the birth. They held her and cried. His mother whispered to her in this soft voice, "I will remember until the day I die." I lay there thinking this is what grandparents were supposed to be. We named her Unia after Holden's grandmother. I sent the announcement anyway. Cream-colored cards with her name and birth date, and a little watercolor of a pear branch. I sent a photo book to my father's office. Leather-bound. The kind he likes. I never heard a word. For 10 months I told myself my father was processing. That he was ashamed of how he'd handled things and didn't know how to make it right. I sent Christmas cards. Easter photos. 6-month milestone pictures. Every time I called my mother and asked about him, she said he was doing well. He sent his love. He was just busy. Then at the end of August, my mother called me. She said my father was turning 66 in October, and they were throwing him a combination birthday and 40-year anniversary gala at the country club. She wanted me to come. She said Bryony had a special announcement. I asked if she meant Bryony was pregnant. There was a pause. Then my mother said in this strange bright voice, I'm not supposed to spoil it, but yes. We're so excited. The first grandchild. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Holden was at work. Unia was in her high chair throwing Cheerios at the dog. I sat there and looked at her and thought about those words. The first grandchild. And something inside me that had been bending for a year finally broke. I told my mother I would come. Then I hung up and called Bryony. My sister picked up on the second ring. I asked her point blank what she was planning to announce. She laughed and said it was a surprise. Then I asked her, "Are you telling Dad you're pregnant?" There was a silence. She said, "Tessa, I've been telling Mom and Dad for about a month now. We wanted to wait for the gala to make it official." I said, "Bryony, I have a daughter. I have had a daughter for 10 months. She said, "I know, sweetie." I said, "Does Dad know?" The pause that followed was the longest pause of my life. She said, "Tessa, Dad has been through a lot this year. The Wilkins deal almost fell apart. His blood pressure has been awful. Mom and we've been protecting him. He doesn't need to be reminded that you ran off and started a whole life without us." I said, "Are you telling me he doesn't know I have a baby?" She said, "He knows you had a child. He just hasn't really engaged with it. And honestly, Tessa, you didn't make it easy. You weren't here. You sent cards, but you never came home." I sat very still. Then I asked about the photo book I had sent his office. She got quiet again. Then she said the receptionist had given it to her because Dad was traveling and she had been meaning to bring it over, but with everything going on, she had just forgotten. It was probably in a drawer somewhere. I hung up on my sister. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time. Unia was asleep in her high chair. Her little fist curled around a half-eaten Cheerio. And I thought something very cold and very clear. No, we are not doing this. I flew to Charleston 4 days before the gala. I told my mother I wanted to come early to help. She booked me a room at the inn near the country club. I rented a car. I needed the freedom. The first thing I did when I landed was drive to my father's office. Delia was still at the front desk. She lit up when she saw me. I asked her very gently if she remembered the photo book I had sent 2 months after my daughter was born. Her face changed. She said yes. She remembered. She said she had set it on his desk personally. She said it had disappeared a few days later. I asked her, "Does my father know I have a baby?" She looked at me for a long moment. This woman who had bandaged my knee at his office Christmas party when I was 8 years old. She said, "Honey, he asked me last month if you were ever going to settle down and have a family." I went out to my rental car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel without moving for 10 minutes. Then I drove to my sister's house. Bryony lived in a renovated antebellum on a tree-lined street. Her housekeeper, a woman named Alda, recognized me from photos and let me in with a hug. She said Bryony was at prenatal yoga. She said I should make myself comfortable. I made myself very comfortable. I started in Bryony's home office. All white shelves and curated books. I went through her desk drawers. I found expense reports. I found receipts for a maternity photo shoot. And in the bottom drawer, taped to the underside, I found a small envelope. Inside were 3 things. The photo book I had sent my father. Untouched. The cellophane wrap still on it. The birth announcement I had sent to my parents. Unopened. And a thumb drive. I took everything. I walked out of her house and drove back to the inn with my hands shaking on the wheel. In my room, I plugged the thumb drive into my laptop. It was a folder of files. Dozens of them. Photos I had texted to my mother. Videos of Unia's first laugh. Screenshots of emails I had written to my father. All forwarded from my mother's account to my sister. And in a folder labeled miscellaneous, I found text messages between my mother and my sister going back almost a year. About me. About how to keep my father from being too involved. About how my mother had intercepted the photo book before it could reach my father's desk. About how Bryony had told my father I had decided not to send a birth announcement because I was going through a rough patch. about how they both agreed it would be better not to push him. And then these words, the real first grandchild. How nice that would be for Daddy. The inheritance question will resolve itself naturally if Tessa stays disconnected. The inheritance question. I sat on the bed and read every single message. I read about how my mother had thrown out the Easter photo. I read about how Bryony had laughed when she saw Unia's 6-month picture and called her a potato. I read about how my mother had asked my father hypothetically what he would do if one of his daughters had a child out of wedlock and didn't tell him. I read his response in all caps with no punctuation. I would cut that mouth off, that's not family, that's anger. Not married. They had told him I wasn't married. Called Holden. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said in that calm voice he uses when he's trying not to break something, "What do you want to do?" I told him I wanted him and Unia to fly out the day of the gala. I told him I wanted them at the country club at exactly 7:30. I told him I needed 3 days to put everything together. He said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. He said, "Okay." The next 2 days I worked. I went to my parents' attorney, a man named Mr. Turney Penland, and showed him the messages. He went very still. Then he said, "You do whatever you need to do at that party. I will be there. I will have everything ready." I went to a printer downtown and had enlargements made. Big ones. Poster board size. The hospital photo of Unia in my arms an hour after she was born. Her 1-month photo. Her first Christmas. Her 6-month milestone sitting in a pumpkin. A picture of her in pear blossoms wearing the same embroidered dress I had been wearing in a photo my father kept on his desk. I had 3 of them mounted and wrapped in plain brown paper and stored in the trunk of my rental car. I bought a dress for the gala. A dark green silk thing my mother would consider too modern. And the morning of the party, I drove out to the country club early and asked the events coordinator if I could borrow the projector and screen for a 5-minute family slideshow during the speeches. I told her it was a surprise gift from my father. She said, of course. I gave her a thumb drive of my own. On it was every photo of my daughter. Every milestone. Every moment my family had tried to erase. Then I sat in my rental car and waited. At 6:45, I walked into the ballroom. My mother saw me first. She floated over in a beaded ivory gown and kissed both my cheeks and told me I looked thin. She introduced me to people I'd known since childhood as if we'd never met. "This is my older daughter, Tessa. She designs buildings. She lives in Oregon now." She said it like I had abandoned the family. Bryony arrived at 7 on the dot, glowing in pale pink with a sash across her belly. My father followed her in, his hand at the small of her back. He saw me. He nodded. He kept walking. He didn't hug me. I felt that nod like a slap. The dinner went on. I sat at the family table and listened to my mother make small talk. I watched my sister glow. At 8:15, my father stood and raised his champagne flute. He talked about my mother for 10 minutes. He talked about Bryony and her husband for 5. He talked about how they were giving him the greatest gift of his life. The gift of a grandchild. The next generation of the family. "And I'm not going to forget this until the day I die," he said. I had almost given up hope. 40 years of marriage, and I thought maybe this old house would never hear the sound of a baby again. The room awed. People wiped their eyes. My mother dabbed at her face with a napkin. Then he turned to me. The whole room was watching. He raised his glass in my direction, this small, reluctant gesture. "And Tessa, of course, we hope someday it'll be your turn too. Someday soon, sweetheart. Don't make us wait too long." I stood up. I held my own glass. I let the silence stretch. I said into that silence, "Daddy, it was 10 months ago." Nobody moved. I said, "Her name is Unia. She was born on a Tuesday morning at 4:19. She weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces. She has her father's eyes. She laughs when the dog runs past her. I sent you a photo book. I sent you a birth announcement. I sent you Christmas cards and Easter cards and 100 photos over 10 months. Not one of them ever made it to your hands. My mother was on her feet. Tessa, sit down right now. I said they were intercepted. Every single one. By Mom and by Bryony. The whole ballroom had gone silent. The events coordinator, was already starting the slideshow. The first photograph of my daughter appeared on the screen behind my father. 11 feet tall. Unia in the hospital, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger. The room gasped. My father turned around. He saw her. He took 2 steps toward that screen and his knees gave out. He sat down hard in his chair. He put his hand over his mouth. The next photo came up. Unia smiling in her bumblebee pajamas. He made a sound I have never heard a grown man make in my life. Bryony was already moving. She was trying to get to the projector. She was saying something about a misunderstanding, about how I had always been jealous, about how this wasn't the time. I said, Mr. Penland is here tonight. He's been my father's attorney for 37 years. He has copies of every text message Mom and Bryony sent each other for 14 months planning how to keep my daughter a secret. He has bank records showing that Bryony has been moving money out of the trust using forged signatures of mine. He has all of it. I looked at my father. I said, Dad, Holden is downstairs in the lobby with Unia. She's been waiting all night to meet you if you want to. My father stood up. He was crying. This man who I had never seen cry in my life, who had not cried at his own mother's funeral, was openly weeping in front of 200 people. He looked at my mother. He looked at Bryony. He looked at the screen where a photo of Unia in her Halloween costume, a tiny pear with a green leaf hat, was filling the room. He said, take me to her. He didn't say another word to my mother or my sister. He walked the entire length of that ballroom with me in front of every person who mattered in Charleston society. And he didn't look back once. Holden was in the lobby standing by the fountain holding our daughter. She was wearing a navy blue velvet dress with white tights. She was awake. She was looking around at the chandeliers with that wide-eyed Unia look where her mouth makes a little O. My father stopped about 10 feet away. He couldn't get closer. He just stood there weeping silently. Then he said, May I? Holden walked over and put my daughter into my father's arms. Unia, who normally screams when strangers wave at her, looked up into his face and put her tiny hand on his cheek. She said, Duh. She said it very clearly. Duh. My father sat down on the edge of the fountain. He held my daughter. He cried and then he laughed and then he cried again. And Unia patted his face like she was reassuring an old friend. He looked up at me. He said, Tessa, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I said, I know, Dad. I know. The fallout came fast. Mr. Penland filed the documents the following Monday. The forgery investigation was federal. Bryony was arraigned 3 weeks later. She lost her seat on the Junior League Board, then the Historical Society, then the country club itself. Pierce filed for divorce 6 weeks into the investigation, citing financial irregularities and a complete loss of trust. She is currently living in my parents' guest house awaiting trial. Her baby was born in March. My father pays for the medical bills. He has not seen the child. My mother spent 2 months in what she called a wellness retreat. When she came back, my father had moved out. He filed for legal separation. He told her he could forgive her for many things in their marriage, but he could not forgive her for stealing his granddaughter. He moved to Portland in February. He bought a small house 6 blocks from ours. Unia calls him Bumpa. He picks her up from daycare 2 days a week. He has missed only 1 pickup in 8 months, and that was because he was in the hospital for a hip replacement. Holden brought Unia to his recovery room with a balloon. I see my mother twice a year. We have lunch. We are polite. She has not met my daughter. I am pregnant again, by the way. A boy this time due in June. When I told my father, he sat down on our couch and put his face in his hands and cried for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "This time, please. I want to know on the day. I want to be the second person you call." He said, "I missed it once. I am not missing it again." I said, "Dad, you'll be the second call right after Holden. Promise." He said, "I don't deserve that." I said, "You do now." And we sat on the couch in my living room with my daughter asleep upstairs, and my husband cooking dinner in the kitchen, and a baby growing inside me that my father would know about from the very first heartbeat. I think about that night at the country club more than I should. Not the slideshow or my father's knees giving out or the silence that fell over 200 people when I said my daughter's name out loud. I think about the version of me who almost didn't go. The version who almost stayed in Portland that weekend. The version who almost let the lie become permanent, one quiet decision at a time. For 10 months I had been telling myself a kind story. I told myself my father was just busy. I told myself my mother meant well. I told myself my sister was caught in the middle. I dressed up cowardice as patience and called it being the bigger person. And while I was being the bigger person, my own child was being erased from the only grandfather she would ever have. The thing nobody tells you about being the unfavored daughter is that you spend your whole life waiting for the favoritism to be a misunderstanding. You think if you just stay quiet enough, the people who hurt you will eventually realize what they had. They don't. Because the favoritism was never about you in the first place. It was about them. It was about my mother needing a daughter who would never leave her orbit of approval. It was about Bryony being willing to play that role for a piece of an inheritance that was never hers to begin with. I had to learn late and painfully that protecting yourself isn't the same as protecting your peace. Real peace requires courage. Real peace requires the moment when you stand up at a long table in front of 200 people and say the true thing out loud. Even when your voice shakes. Even when your mother hisses at you to sit down. Even when every cell in your body remembers being the quiet daughter who never made a scene. I wasn't quiet that night. And the world did not end. My family ended. The false version of it. The painted-over version that had me posing for Christmas cards next to people who were stealing from me. But something truer was waiting underneath. A father who carried my daughter to the fountain and wept. A husband who flew across the country with our baby in a velvet dress and never asked why I needed him there. A grandfather who picks Unia up from daycare twice a week now and has not been late once. If you take anything from my story, take this. The people who love you will not let other people speak for you. If someone in your life keeps insisting on being the bridge between you and the people you love, ask yourself why. Bridges are for crossing. The ones who build them and then guard the gate are not protecting anyone but themselves. Walk around them. Pick up the phone. Drive to the office. Show up at the door with the baby in your arms. Let them see what they were told didn't exist. The truth will not deliver itself. Mine almost didn't. I came so close to never knowing. So close to showing up at Christmas one year and finding my sister's son in my father's lap. Hearing him called the firstborn. Watching my own daughter be erased from a family she never even got to know. I'm so glad I stood up. I'm so glad I drove to Charleston 4 days early. I'm so glad my daughter has a grandfather who shows up. Don't wait. Don't assume. Don't let other people be the bridge. The truth is waiting on the other side. You just have to be brave enough to walk through.